Section 4, Two Great Struggles, Upcountry versus Low Country, England versus France. Your essential question will be, how did conflicts shape the lives of the people in the royal colony? Some of the terms that you'll need to be familiar with are regulators, Circuit Court Act of 1769, French and Indian War, and Treaty of Paris of 1763. Introduction and the Cherokee War. The population of the Midlands and Piedmont sections of South Carolina were growing rapidly in the 1750s and 1760s. This placed increased pressure on the area's small remaining Indian population, mostly of which were the Cherokee. The growth also meant that the upcountry white population soon came to far outnumber the whites in the low country. Yet all the power and political control remained in the hands of the coastal planters, merchants, and lawyers. This has to be remembered. Scots-Irish and Pennsylvania Dutch have immigrated in the droves into the upcountry or backcountry, and they far outnumber the whites living in the low country, but the power politically and economically is still in the hands of that small group of planters, merchants, and lawyers living in the low country. At the same time these struggles were going on within South Carolina, a larger struggle was taking place on the North American continent. England's empire was competing with other empires for economic dominance. The British shared North America not happily with two other empires. That would be the French and the Spanish. The British competed with the Spanish and the French for territory, trade, and alliances with Indian tribes. Each empire considered the others a threat to its power and prosperity. The Cherokee in western South Carolina and beyond will ally themselves with the British because the British will promise to protect them from their enemy, the Creek Indian Nation. So France is competing with Carolina traders among the Indians, and they are a military threat, especially after the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1754. Governor James Glenn of South Carolina had made great diplomatic efforts to keep the Cherokee as friendly allies. Now, by diplomatic efforts, we mean trying to actively keep the peace between the two sides, the white settlers and the Native Americans. The guy that replaces him, Governor William Lyttleton, Lyttleton, will not care about maintaining a diplomatic relationship between the white settlers and the Cherokee. In fact, it'll be the furthest thing from his mind. As a result, because of the way that the white settlers were treating the Cherokee, and because so many of the white settlers are migrating into their area, the Cherokee War breaks out. From 1759 to 1761, many settlers and Native Americans will be killed. The Native Americans will attack white settlements and kill men, women, and children, and in vice versa, many white settlers and colonial militia will attack Native American villages and kill men, women, and children. So it's sort of tit for tat. This results in the end that the Cherokee are forced to surrender. It's just too much for them to overcome. The whites have the better weaponry, not to mention diseases are still rampant and taking them out. And so when it's all said and done, they end up getting the northwestern corner of South Carolina as Cherokee territory. So that would comprise the present-day counties of Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee counties. upcountry versus low country. Obviously, there is a big cultural difference between the people living in the upcountry and the people living in the low country. You have to remember that the Scots-Irish had been driven out of England, out of Scotland by King James. So they already have a very abrasive relationship, to say the least, with the English. Um, and then they moved, as we recall from the video, they moved over to Ireland, lived there for about 100 years, and then migrate to America during the 1700s. So already the Scots-Irish do not like the English. And if you'll remember, the majority of the settlers in the Low Country are of English descent. If they're not of English descent, they are of Barbadian descent. So again, there's this big distinction between these two groups. Also, the people living in the backcountry are from a lower socioeconomic status than those living in the low country. They just don't have the money and the means that the people in the low country have. So it's these folks could not be any more different if they were trying to be. So since 1670, there was controversy and conflict over government control, class distinction, and sectional struggles between these two groups. During the 1760s, folks living in the upcountry had several complaints. Number one was that they had very little representation in the Commons House of the General Assembly. You've got to remember that the colonial capital is in Charlestown. So the General Assembly will be there, and this is a long way to travel in order to take care of any business that you have politically. Not to mention, what were the requirements to hold political office in South Carolina? You had to own 10 slaves and 500 acres of land. How many people in the backcountry of South Carolina owned 500 acres of land and 10 slaves? Not many. So as a result, the majority of the folks that were in the Commons House of the General Assembly were from the Low Country. Second biggest problem is that their farmland was being taxed at the same rate as or more than the cash producing lands or the plantation owners' lands. It's just not fair. Again, I use this example in class, but 10% on $10 is $1, whereas 10% on $100 is $10. So it's just not, when you look at the two, somebody that's got more money can afford to pay higher taxes, whereas these folks that are living day to day and barely making ends meet, they just can't afford it. Our third problem is that part of the taxes that these people in the backcountry are paying is going to support the Anglican Church, which, as you remember, is the official church of South Carolina, and most of these folks are not Anglican. They are dissenters, which means that they are of a different denomination. That most of them are Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists, Lutherans, and several other denominations, but they're not Anglican. So again, they have a problem with their taxes going to pay for this. Fourth problem, most of the money was being used for coastal fortifications, not protection for them from Indians and the French. So the people in the Low Country, they're building fortifications along the coast in case they get attacked by sea from the Spanish or the French, but they're not building any kind of forts to protect the people living in the upcountry from an Indian attack or the French if they decide to attack. So it's really unfair, again, when you look at it from the upcountry's point of view. Our biggest problem out of all of these, though, is that there is a lack of law enforcement and a court system in the upcountry. This is the area where if you committed a crime, you ran to hide out, because quite frankly, the law in the Low Country is not going to come up here after you. So highwaymen and robbers on the King's Highway which is now present-day Highway 17, they would commit these crimes and then come up here and hide out because they knew nobody could stop them. Let's talk about the regulators. Because there was inadequate protection and they were getting no help from Charlestown, just like in today's society, people will take the law into their own hands when they feel like they are not being protected. So as a result, vigilante groups begin to form on the frontier, and they call themselves regulators. These guys, they're not dressing up like superheroes or anything. They're just riding around on their horses. But the problem is that they have named themselves judge, jury, and executioner. And you have to remember that in America, we have a system of law and order, which means that if you are arrested for a crime, you are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law by a jury of your peers. Well, these guys can basically set themselves up as judge, jury, and executioners. So if they find somebody, they don't bother to wait and prove that they're innocent before they convict them of a crime, and then they go out and hang them, and it's just something that really gets out of hand. It does help to clean up the problem with these criminal gangs, but at the same token, there will be some of these regulators that will take advantage of it and try to gain land or other financial advances by cheating the system, so to speak. So the General Assembly in 1769 will pass the Circuit Court Act, and this is really what needed to happen. They set up 6 new courts, 3 in the Low Country, one of which had already been in Charlestown, but they'll set up 1 in Beaufort and 1 in Georgetown, and then they'll set up 4 in the Up Country, 1 in Orangeburg, 1 in 96, 1 in Camden, and 1 in Cheraw. Now, it's important that you remember that these areas will not have a full-time judge. This is why it's called a circuit court. The judge would travel between these areas, usually on a 4 to 6 week rotation. And so, for instance, if you are arrested for a crime, you will sit in jail for about 4 or 6 weeks, waiting for the judge to arrive so that your case can be heard and then a verdict read about what your penalty is going to be. In the end, the regulators will be pardoned and order will be restored, and peaceful relations will be reestablished between the upcountry and low country, but there will still be sectional differences and these huge class distinctions. You got to remember, the upcountry doesn't like the low country people because they know that the low country thinks they're better than they are. The mighty struggle for empire. The 1700s were a very tumultuous time in Europe. You got to remember that the big 3, Britain, France, and Spain, are in constant competition with one another. Just like, in college football, Clemson, South Carolina, and Georgia constantly compete with each other, and not only on the football field but for recruits, because they want to establish a dominant foothold in college football. Each one of these countries wants to establish a dominant foothold over the other 2. So they are the most powerful nations in Europe, and again, each are seeking dominance. An immediate threat to South Carolina is going to be the Spanish from St. Augustine and the French, especially during the French and Indian War. Now, we will never have any battles take place in South Carolina during the French and Indian War, thankfully. The only thing that really breaks out, again, is going to be the Cherokee War. We will send support, men and weapons, to aid the British during the French and Indian War, but there will never actually be any battles to take place in South Carolina. But this will eventually become a battle royale for control of North America. The wars for empire. From 1689 to 1763, there were 4 major wars among the powers in Europe. By the mid-1700s, there was aggressive competition between the British and the French for control of North America. The biggest area that they're going to be fighting over is the Ohio River Valley. It's very important that you remember this. It's basically the land that is between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So if you need to look at your map in your textbook to understand exactly where that's at, do that. But it's the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Because this area is so rich in the fur trade, and this is a great source of wealth. Not only that, but also trade with the Native Americans. So, the French and Indian War will break out in 1754. The British will have some allies, particularly in South Carolina. We've already talked about the Cherokee will ally themselves with the British, but also the Catawba. But the majority of Indians are going to side with the French, simply because the French are going to tell them, look, if you help us out when we win the war, we're going to give you your lands back. Now, whether or not they would have held up their end of the deal, I don't know. But that's exactly what they're telling the Indians, and really the Indians have nothing to lose. So, but the war is actually pretty interesting. George Washington is the one primarily responsible for this. He is sent by Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia to basically tell the French, look, you've got to get out. And they, in a very diplomatic way, tell George Washington, no, we're not going to do that. And so he returns the message to Governor Dinwiddie, and that essentially starts the French and Indian War. At the time, Washington was only about 19, 20 years old, but he was very ambitious and wanted to make a name for himself. So he was more than happy to get involved with this. By 1756, the war had spread to Europe, and last year you should have learned that over in Europe it's known as the 7 Years' War, and it is the first truly global war in history involving all the great powers in Europe. The war will actually take place in places as far away as Africa, India, and even in the Philippines. When everything's said and done, Britain will emerge victorious, but they are left in a great deal of debt. Okay? And how does a government recoup its losses when it's in debt? They raise taxes. This is important to remember, especially when we start studying about the American Revolution in Chapter 7. The war will officially end when the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1763. The British Empire will become the mightiest empire on earth, and they will receive the entire North American continent east of the Mississippi River and west of the Appalachian Mountains, except for New Orleans. That will remain in French hands.